Hi, I'm Anna and welcome back to my channel. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to say that I have noticed recently that my channel has reached 50 subscribers. And I know most people are like, 50 subscribers? That's nothing. But for me, the fact that 50 individual people were like, hey, I'm going to subscribe to this channel is pretty awesome to me. So thank you everyone for subscribing. Now onto the video. So today I am wrapping up the books that I read in March of 2021. I read 17 books, which is pretty impressive for me because I have been reading like 10 to 12 books a month for a while, and sometimes I have a better month, but 17 books is more than average for me. However, that does not mean that I read incredibly good books this month. I had a lot of disappointments. I will be organizing them according to my star rating on Goodreads. So I'm going to start with 1 star and then work my way up to, well, there's no 5 stars this month, but 4 stars. So I had only one star read this month, which is great, but I rarely give books 1 stars because usually I have at least something in them that I liked. But this one, I'm very, very rarely triggered when reading a book, and this book triggered me. And that is India Black by Carol K. Carr. So this is the first book of the Madam of Espionage. It is set in the 1870s, and it follows this woman, India Black, who is a madam. She runs a prostitution house. And she gets drawn up into this conspiracy, and there's spies, and it's half mystery, half suspense, thriller. The mystery wasn't that bad, okay? But I really, really hated the idealization of prostitution during that time. Let me just say, prostitution in the Victorian era was not sunshine and flowers. It was not about women that were like, I'm going to just go out and sell my body because I want to. No, these were usually women who were impoverished. They had often been left by men and they had nowhere else to go, so often they were forced into prostitution. I mean, the Victorian era is infamous for how bad sexual diseases went around, and this book glamorized the idea of prostitution houses, and it really pissed me off. So I could not enjoy the rest of the book because of the way they handled the prostitution. I would have no problem if they looked at the more serious sides of prostitution, but also appreciated that this woman, India, didn't really have a choice in becoming a madam if she wanted to stay financially viable and support herself. But they didn't do that. They made it seem all glamorized and fun and lighthearted and funny, and I just hated it. So yes, 1 star, and I'm not going to continue on in this series. Now we're going to go into the 2 stars, and I have got some very random books that I read. So the next book is Falling for the Mysterious Viscount by Bridget Barton. This book is a clean historical romance, and it follows this Viscount who he is sick of all these women always pursuing him for his wealth. And he hasn't been to the London season for a long time, but he's getting pressure from his family to get married. So he decides to disguise himself as this more impoverished man, or at least not a super wealthy man. He's still landowning and he's just not super wealthy. And so he disguises himself and meets this young woman, Lavinia, and her goal is to marry for life. She's sick of her parents trying to push her into finding this wealthy man. So she meets this Viscount Samuel, and she's like, oh, he's just a normal person. I get along with him, blah, blah, blah. And of course, you can probably see where the plot is going. They fall in love, and then things happen. She finds out he's the Viscount, and I won't get into spoilers. I really loved the beginning of this book, and Lavinia and Samuel were just kind of adorable together in the beginning, but then it all went downhill from like the 25% to the end. It was just, the book was filled with too many misunderstandings, and they were kind of contrived misunderstandings that didn't really feel like they added anything to the plot. It was just more there to add pad time, and I really, really disliked that. So I liked the beginning, I liked the end, I thought it was cute. Just all the misunderstandings like took this from like a 4 star for me to like a 2 star. The next book is Never Never by Brianna R. Shroom. So this is a retelling of Peter Pan, but from the perspective of Hook. Captain Hook. Everybody loves Captain Hook. I love Captain Hook. He is an exceptional villain, but I really hated what they did with this story. First of all, it's just a really boring book. So it starts off when Hook is a young boy and he meets Peter Pan in London, and Peter ends up telling him like, oh, you can come to this island, you can never grow up. And Hook is like, well, I'll spend like 2 weeks there and then I'll come home, because Hook really wants to grow up, but he also just wants a vacation. So they go to Neverland and Hook sees all this stuff. He meets the Lost Boys, blah, blah, blah. And then he ends up realizing, well, Peter's not going to take me home, so I'm stuck there. And so as the story develops, he becomes Hook. There's also this weird romance between Hook and Tiger Lily. But besides the book just being kind of very slow moving and boring, I also felt like it got rid of a lot of the subtlety of the original. The great thing about Peter and Wendy, which is the original book, is that you never know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. Is Peter Pan really good? Or is he dangerous? There's always that question. And same thing with Hook. You see some good qualities in Hook in the original book, and you're like, well, do we really hate Hook? Or is it just Peter's perception of Hook that we hate? But in this book, it kind of took it like Peter Pan's evil, Hook is good and misunderstood. It took away all the subtlety, and I just really disliked that. So I ended up giving this 2 stars, and I wouldn't recommend it. I think there's so many better retellings of Peter Pan out there. The next 2-star read for me was Cocaine Blues. What a title! By Carrie Greenwood. This is the first book of the Fine Fisher series. They made a TV series of it. The Miss Fisher murder mystery series is kind of big. That's my point. So I really wanted to read this book, especially it's a light book. I thought it would be fun to read, and I didn't like it. Fine Fisher is a strange individual. On one hand, she can be cruel and callous, and they make it out to be funny, and I really dislike that. But then randomly, she's just very nice. Like, she meets this young woman, Dorothy, and she kind of takes her in and has her become her maid. And while this is going on, of course, they're solving this murder mystery and stuff like that is going on. You couldn't really have the character both ways, so I had no understanding of her character at all by the end, and I just really disliked her character. The murder mystery wasn't horrible, but it also wasn't great, and I've read so much better murder mysteries. I was like, is this really that good? Probably not. The next book is one that I feel really bad for disliking, and I talked about this book in my recent releases that I read, so watch that for more fuller thoughts, and that is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. And so it follows this AF artificial friend who is chosen by the sickly girl to be her robot friend, and it's kind of about her life with that girl and her obsession with the sun almost as a god. This book was just really boring, and I could not figure out the themes and meaning. It was just all over the place in everything, and I was really disappointed, and I talked more about it in the other video, so watch that if you're curious to hear more of my thoughts. The next book is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Nye. I just think Nye just isn't for me. I read her book Little Fires Everywhere a couple years ago, and I just hated it. I gave it 1 star, and so this one was slightly better. It follows this family. The father is Asian, the mother is white. The only reason I mention that is that was a big part of the book, is the racial issues going on in the 1970s. And this family with the parents and 3 kids, the oldest daughter turns up in a lake dead, and the rest of the book is kind of backtracking to figure out why that happened. Is it suicide? Is it murder? What's going on? We don't know. This book was a complete mess. First of all, again, it was just boring, but also all the characters were horrible human beings. And I'll give you just one example because I think it happens relatively early on, so it's not really a spoiler. The mother leaves the family with no note. I believe she leaves a note, but she doesn't say where she's going. No contact information to go back to college when her husband has 2 young kids to take care of. And she just leaves them for like 3-4 months or something until she finds out that she is pregnant. And so she has to like return to them, and then she becomes obsessed with making her oldest daughter into a doctor because that's what she wanted to be, and she feels like being married took that away from her. And I'm like, no, you're an idiot. You're an idiot. You still could have continued school and like worked with your family. There was no communication. She just left. And I'm like, you are an absolute narcissist. Same thing with the husband. I won't give spoilers because I feel like this happens later on, so I won't mention it. But he also is a horrible human being. And the children are just so messed up because of how horrible their parents are that I couldn't enjoy a second of this book because I wanted to like hit everyone's heads against a wall and say, you're stupid. I noticed that's similar to my reaction with the previous book I read by Celeste, so I just think her writing isn't for me. The next book is The Last Neanderthal by Claire Cameron. So I bought this from Book Outlet a year or two ago. I don't remember. I feel like a lot of historical novels nowadays tell the story of two different time periods. So you will have a modern perspective and a historic perspective. But usually that historical perspective is like the 1940s or the Victorian era. And what was really intriguing to me about the premise of this was that you have the story of this Neanderthal, this young girl trying to survive. And then you have this archaeologist who's pregnant in the modern day that found the bones of the girl and is kind of investigating it. So I loved the premise. I loved that idea of telling two stories, but worlds apart. But I really disliked this book and I felt bad about it. One, it was just really boring. I would say about 80% of the book, at least 75% of the book, was in the girl's perspective 40,000 years ago with the Neanderthals, and the modern perspective was only like 25%. So it was a very small amount. Also, the modern parts were just completely pointless and horrible, and I didn't care if they weren't in there at all. Some of the scenes with the girl in the prehistoric era were interesting, but I also got annoyed because the plot seemed to follow this rinse and repeat method. Exploring, scavenging, sex, someone dies. And then rinse and repeat for the rest of the book. And it just got really annoying after a while. Because I'm like, yeah, okay, everybody dies. That's nice. Also, like, everyone is obsessed with sex in the prehistoric world, which is nice. I mean, I get like procreation was obviously important to all civilizations, but just weird. There were some cool attack and fighting scenes that I was like, yeah, go girl. But for the most part, it was just boring. The only good message about this book is that the main idea of this book is to humanize the girl and the Neanderthals, because this author is pretty much saying just because these are prehistoric people doesn't mean they aren't human or mostly like us. And I feel like that's the case nowadays, where we often think the people who came before us were less smart, which they weren't. They just didn't have the advancements that we have, advancements of thousands of years of history of people who have tried different things and gained understanding and then moved to the next step, and we're just the next step. So I really liked that message, but for the most part, the plot was pretty boring. Finally, we are going to the 3 stars reviews, and the next book, I talked about it in my recent releases video. That is The Children's Blizzard by Melanie Benjamin. This tells the fictional story of the 1988 schoolhouse blizzard, where over 100 children and people died in this unexpected blizzard that came across the Great Plains in January of that year. And it's pretty horrific, but I also found the story had a lot of filler, especially when it came to the backgrounds of the characters and what happened after the blizzard. The blizzard scenes were exceptional, but around that, it was a little boring. The next book I also talked about in the video, and that is The Sanatorium by Sarah Peirce. This is a thriller mystery that takes place in this sanatorium in Switzerland that has been converted into this hotel. And this young woman, Ellen, comes to the hotel to celebrate her brother getting married, and murder ends up happening, and there's some weird stuff going on, and they're isolated because this massive blizzard hits and the police can't get to them. And so she has to solve the mystery. And I loved this book up to the ending, and then the ending was just horrible. All the pieces fell apart, and yeah, I thought it was very poorly finished, and there were all these random twists that were thrown in just to make it interesting, and it just did not fit at all. So yeah, great book, horrible ending. The next one I also talked about in that video, and that is The Last Garden of England by Julia Kelly. This book follows 3 different eras, 1907, 1944, and present day, of these 3 women that were tied to the garden. You have the woman originally designing the garden in 1907. You have a woman coming to stay as a farmhand nearby the garden in the 40s during World War II. And then you have this modern landscaper who in the modern day comes to rejuvenate the garden. So you have these 3 timelines. My biggest criticism is that all the timelines were very interesting, but they didn't fit together that much, and there was way too much jumping. It was like the author was trying to do everything, have 3 different, almost perfectly not connected stories, and have them fit together, and it just didn't work. I liked some of the twists at the ending, and I liked each story in general, but it just didn't fit together. The next book is The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. So this book had a very intriguing premise, which is why I picked it up. So in the 1950s, you have this village. Everyone just vanished, except for there was this woman's body that was found in the center of town, and she'd been literally stoned to death, and this baby that was found crying in the school all alone. So flash forward to the modern day. Alice is our main character, and she's this young woman whose grandmother's family were some that disappeared in the town, and her grandmother told her stories of this family for her entire growing up years. And of course her grandmother has now passed away, but Alice is obsessed with this story, and she wants to find out what happened to all these villagers. So she goes with this film crew to film the town. I feel like this would be fitting better for a movie. But so of course weird things start to happen. They hear footsteps, one of them gets attacked, there's something weird going on in the town and they don't know what. This is more of a thriller than a horror, but I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of focus on the characters and less so of the mystery. So the story is divided up into the modern day of this film crew that's kind of trying to figure out what happened, and then the 1950s, where the perspective of the Alice's great-grandmother and her grandmother's sister, who both disappeared in the town. And so you're kind of trying to figure out what happened while also hearing their story. It was really intriguing. I really loved the setup. Saying that, the book was a little bit slow and it was very predictable. By the time I was about 25% into the book, I'd figured out what had happened, mostly. There were like a couple twists at the end that I didn't see coming. So I was a little bit disappointed with how obvious the mystery was early on, and I didn't feel like you needed all those jump backs to the past. I would have preferred it more if you'd stayed in the present. I also felt bad. There's a couple of like my favorite characters that got killed, and I felt very bad because I like them. And finally, we are getting to 4 stars. So these are the books that I really enjoyed this month. I had 5 books, but I didn't have any 5 stars. And the first book was Lost Boys by Orson Scott Card. So this book follows this family who moves into this town where a bunch of these young boys are vanishing, and the father works as a video game developer. This is set in 80s, 90s. It looks like it was published in 92, so I'm going to assume it took place around that time too. And their son starts to become friends with boys whose names are eerily similar to the boys who vanished. And yeah, so it's part mystery, but mostly it's a family drama. What I didn't expect going into this is how little the actual mystery would play a part. This is over 500-page book, and it is very focused on the family, on drama problems in the town. There's a lot of red herrings or them trying to figure out the psychological issues of their son, you also have conflict with the main character who makes video games and the conflict he runs into in his new job. And there's financial issues. So it's very much a family drama that just has mystery as secondary. So once I got over that, I really enjoyed this book. And boy, that twist at the end. The next book is Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. I did a whole 30-minute review for this book, so I'm not going to get into it that much. It's the last book of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, or the Grishaverse trilogy. I'm not sure, but it follows the adventures of Alina Starkov, the Sun Summoner, and the Darkling. And it's actually only a couple weeks away from the release of the Netflix series that's based on this book. And I keep watching the trailers for it, and I'm like, ooh, this looks good, but even then there's some things in it where I'm like, why are you giving the Darkling a weird name that was not in the book, okay? In this book, he reveals what his name was, and it wasn't that. So it's odd because if you watch my full review for this book, you'll see that I actually didn't like the first book that much. And the second book, I was like, there's some things I like about it, but it's still bad. And then this book I gave 4 stars. So it's very weird to me that the book series went up instead of down. Usually my opinion of books goes down as the series continues, but this one it went up. Maybe I just the characters started to grow on me. The next book is another one that I had reviewed in my recent releases, so I talked more about that in that video. And that is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This is the first series, the first book in a series. The second book is going to come out at the end of this year, I believe, and it is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai, and there is this strange monster in the Huangpo River. You have people randomly clawing out their throats. You have 2 rival gangs where the main character is Juliet Tsai, and she is part of the Scarlet Gang, and then you have Roma Montakov, and he is part of the White Flowers, and you have them kind of falling in love, or something happened in the past, and they fell in love and then broke apart, and now they're meeting again, and they have to solve these mysteries together. It's a fun story. I really liked it. I definitely was expecting more romance because there's not much romance in this, but I also feel like I don't personally like romance that much, so I didn't mind that, but I was expecting more because it's retelling of Romeo and Juliet. I don't expect it to be fixated mostly on monsters. It was also really interesting, the political stuff that was going on in 1920s Shanghai, which I know a little bit from my previous research, so I just enjoyed that. It was a good book. I enjoyed it. Yeah, that's about it. The next book is King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. This is a historical nonfiction that follows King Leopold, who created this forced labor system in the Congo in Africa and participated in the genocide of millions of Africans. Okay, so that's what it's about. It's this unknown genocide that was committed by Belgians, King Leopold, and it kind of follows a whole bunch of people from the 1870s all the way to the 1920s, and how some people helped him to perpetrate these horrible crimes, and then some people actually found out about it, and public opinion slowly turned against him. And I read it for my Africa in Bondage class. The final 4-star read is Stillhouse Lake by Rachel Kane. So this book was really good. It was really close to getting 5 stars, but I decided, it's not quite good enough, okay? I'm very picky about my 5 stars, clearly. So this book follows Gwen, who moves to this town by this lake called Stillhouse Lake, and her real name is actually Gina, and she was married to this serial killer. And after he was arrested and found out to be a serial killer, everybody thought that she was in on it, so people went after her and went after her children. So she changed her name, she changed her children's name, and now they're hiding in this location, Stillhouse Lake, in the country. And a body turns up in the lake, and the MO is very similar to her husband's victims, even though he is still in high security prison. And this was a really good book, especially since it really focused on the psychology of finding out your husband is a serial killer and then having to deal with that psychologically while also being threatened, having your life threatened constantly because everyone thinks you were involved in it when you were really just like innocent and probably should have noticed some signs but didn't, so it's not really your fault. Anyway, I really enjoyed this book. It was a fun mystery, and it's very different from most mysteries I've read because it really focused on Gwen's internal fears and insecurities and her vast protection of her children that is often to their detriment because she's just trying to protect them, but in doing so she's keeping them from living, in a sense. So it was a really intriguing book. I really liked it, and I hope to continue on in the series, even though the books are not as much at my library, so it may be harder to get a hold of them, but I highly enjoyed it. So there are the books that I read in March of 2021. So have you read any of these books? Do you have similar thoughts to me or different thoughts to me? Just curious to know your thoughts in general. Thank you so much for watching. And also, if you are one of the 50 people who are subscribed to me, or I think it's like 54 at this point, if you are among the 54 people subscribed to me, I tip my tea to you and thank you. And I will see you all in the next video. Bye!